let me just say a little bit about myself before I start. As Sebastian said, I have been with this University of Tromsø since its very beginning in 1972. I came up there, I had just finished my, what do you call, civiløkonom. That's a title here as well. And then I moved up there and I moved into sociology. And that's basically where I have stayed since, although I do not anymore have a clear disciplinary identity, because I worked with people from so many disciplines over the years, and that has of course left a mark on me. I work with people from all the social sciences, and in recent years also with biologists. None of this made me a, working with biologists didn't make me a biologist by no means, but I hope that it made me a better social scientist. The only discipline I haven't worked with, which I sort of regret, are the philosophers. But I keep bumping into them all the time, which this lecture will show. Because some of the things I will talk about here is inspired by biologists. Fisheries was always an interest to me, and that has to do with where I grew up. Fishing industry is of enormous importance for the region where I'm born and where I live. So that sort of comes naturally. This fisheries college at the University of Tromsø was a new thing. We never had such a thing in Norway. We had an agricultural university, but it took 100 years before we got a similar institution in Norway then devoted to the fishery, which is sort of strange because fishery was always an important and much more perhaps important industry for Norway than agriculture ever was. So I've been with this institution more or less, spent a few years with the social science faculty in Tromsø, and now I'm back with the Fisheries College, but I recently retired, so I'm now an emeritus, which gives me certain freedoms, but not necessarily less work. So that's where I am now. I've been around, as Sebastian suggested. I worked in recent years a lot with the FAO, the UN Organization for Food and Agriculture, within which also fisheries are. And what I will talk about here is some of the work I've been involved with. I will not present what we have done, but I will present some reflections based on what I have done with FAO. Just back from half a year in Rome, working on issues related to poverty in small-scale fisheries, also in the context of climate change. So this is where I will begin. But I should also say that I'm a founding member of this, we can now call it an organization, almost, the Too Big to Ignore, a global partnership for small-scale fisheries research, which is a program which is funded by the Canadian Research Institute. We are now next week organizing the 3rd World Small-Scale Fisheries Conference in Chiang Mai in Thailand, and I know that some of you here, Milena, where are you? She's going there. And I will also go there directly from here. Just a few numbers, which is a screenshot from FAO, the webpage about small-scale fisheries. Statistics in this particular part of the industry is always unreliable, due to the fact that small-scale fisheries is often a very informal kind of activity. You know, the governments do not follow it, or they don't care about it. They just let it happen. And this informality makes it, the data always uncertain. Not even the FAO has clear data of how many there are out there. So this 120 million is just an estimate. We know that there's a lot, but whether the amount is 120 more or less is not easy to say. But the estimate is that over 90% of the people employed in this industry are actually employed in this small-scale fisheries sector. So, you know, if you are a social scientist as me, if you're interested in fisheries, you end up in small-scale fisheries because there's where the people are. There's where a lot of social stuff is happening. Yeah, and you also see there to the right that poverty is a real issue. Doesn't come as a surprise, I guess, but that's a fact. 5.8 million earn less than $1 per day, which is the limit for the extreme poverty, right? Yes. So this is makes small-scale fisheries also an issue in this context. The UN Sustainable Development Goals. Goal number 1 suggests no poverty. But unless small-scale fisheries are brought out of their often dismal situation, their contribution to global food supply will be hampered. So in the context of small-scale fisheries, the sustainable goals 1 and 2 are closely linked. Bringing people out of poverty is, of course, an important thing in itself, but it also has that consequence for the ability of these people to actually deliver on sustainable development goal number 2. And this is an important reason why the FAO developed these voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, these guidelines were endorsed by FAO member states in 2014. Sweden is also part of this, but the negotiations, you were represented by the EU Commission, whereas Norway could be directly there, actually. Anyway, I have the privilege of being part of actually developing these guidelines. I was part of the Norwegian delegation who negotiated these guidelines. I wouldn't take any ownership of them, but they have indeed interested me a lot. So I use every opportunity actually which I have, including this, to actually mention them and talk a little bit about them, because I do think they are important. And because they relate to so many out there, I think they have a significance, and I think that they should actually interest us all. What is also important is that they recognize that the academic community has a role to play. Social scientists like me often complain that no one listens to us. You know, governments lend their ear to biologists and economists, and that's it. Well, with the small-scale fisheries guidelines, I do not think we have any reason to complain anymore. The small-scale fisheries guidelines are, as the title say, they are voluntary, meaning that they are so-called soft law. States are not obliged to actually implement them, which some states in the end might not do. Still, by endorsing these guidelines, member states made a promise to implement. But it should not come as a surprise. We should not assume necessarily that all states will do that. I don't know about Sweden, but I would have something to say about Norway if you ask me. Well, failing to implement these guidelines may have legitimate reasons, like unforeseen, unsurmountable obstacles. The guidelines call for institutional reform, major institutional reform, including governance reform. They have a strong focus on equity, gender, all within a human rights framework. Still, there are every reason to assume that they will meet resistance in many quarters when they hit the ground, that they will be opposed, because they do challenge the established order of things, including power relations, and the guidelines actually recognize that. We should not exclude the possibility that many FAO states made a promise in bad faith, that they knew already then that they would not implement them. In any case, the implementation of these guidelines, their journey from the international global level to the local level, is a process, a journey worth following. This is a research topic, you know. How do they fare what happens when they land? This would be a topic of implementation research. And you do not necessarily have to be a fisheries social scientist to find them interesting. Well, some have actually started to study their implementation. And this is a book that came out in 2017. And there is a chapter by Milena and Sebastian in that chapter, in that book, 900 pages book with case studies from around the world. Endorsing the SSF guidelines, therefore, may just involve what Niels Brunson, this is for the political scientists in the room, Niels Brunson called organizational hypocracy. Maybe the states have done this when they endorsed it just because of legitimate reasons. They want to actually look good in the environment. You know, to actually go against these guidelines take some guts, because they come with a very strong moral language, a moral obligation. There is, as Brunson correctly points out, often a disconnect between how we talk and how we act. But sometimes we do indeed walk the talk. We do live up to our commitments, if not for other reasons, that there are limits to how hypocritical we can be until someone holds us accountable. However, my issue is not specifically about what we say and what we do. Whether, for instance, the endorsement of these guidelines will be followed by concrete reform that people on the ground will notice. My topic here is slightly different than this. In a way, I argue the opposite of what Brunson is arguing. I say there is a close connection, not necessarily about what we say and what we do, but there is a close connection between how we say it and how we do it. In other words, I argue that our conceptual framework, how we talk about a problem, like, for instance, climate change and poverty, and how these two issues are connected, how we talk about this and how we act on it. In other words, how we govern, right? The link is often very subtle. We may not always be aware of how our conceptualizations determine our governance. But even if it's not politically intentional, this connection, the link is far from politically inconsequential. The link between how we say it and how we do it. The small-scale fisheries guidelines have a whole chapter on climate change, which I will talk about in the following. Small-scale fisheries communities are particularly vulnerable, given their location often on the beachfront. Small-scale fisheries are already among, if not perhaps even the most dangerous occupation that you can actually have. Well, the impacts of climate change, like extreme weather, is adding to this risk. If you need to base your scenario of something real and tangible, go to islands in the Caribbean or to Bangladesh, where this photo is taken. This is a photo taken after a hurricane or a cyclone just a few years ago. Look at the erosion. If you happen to have your house on that edge, it will be gone. Here is another one from Bangladesh. These photos were taken by a person I cooperate with a lot, and we have a recent report on the situation in Bangladesh. The situation is here that with every cyclone that ruin homes and take away material possessions, small-scale fisheries people have to start their lives all over again if they are lucky to survive. And throughout a lifetime, this just not only happen once, it may be a situation that is recurrent. So, and this is about the nexus. Being poor means that your climate change coping capacity is low. If your community is also poor and fragmented, you are basically left to fend for yourself. Therefore, implementing these guidelines in a way that will effectively reduce poverty will also be good climate change adaptation policy. Not only are small-scale fishing people particularly exposed to climate change due to their location and where they operate, being poor means that they are also vulnerable. Climate change impacts such as natural hazards make poor people even poorer, as is the case in Bangladesh, and thereby reduce their capacity to protect themselves in the face of climate change. One reinforces the other in a vicious circle. This is the climate change poverty nexus. It means that SDGs 1 and 2 that are linked are together also linked with SDG number 13, which is about climate change action. And they all come together in small-scale fisheries, especially, but not exclusively, in the global south, where most of the small-scale fisheries are happening. Desmond Tutu has something to say on the matter, which relate directly to my topic here, which is about climate change and poverty and how we talk about it. The language we use has an impact of how we act upon it and how we govern. Therefore, perhaps the starting point is to reflect on the inadequacy of language. The word adaptation had become part of the standard climate change vocabulary. But what does adaptation mean? The answer to that question is different things in different places. What, for instance, does adaptation mean to people who are already poor and who are struggling to survive even without climate change? The philosopher J.L. Austin, he is famous for his book, How We Do Things with Words. An intriguing title, I would say. He posits in this book that the words we use are not just descriptive or constative. You know, they state the facts. Do not only capture reality, they help to create that reality. Thus, the word we use when we talk about climate change may not be the wake-up call that we need them to be. Adaptation can obviously be a descriptive term for what is actually happening or not. But the term has also a performative function. It tells us what to do. Therefore, we should not just ask for the meaning of a word, but also for its use, as also Wittgenstein argued. As an undergraduate, I was intrigued by a Norwegian sociologist, University of Oslo, just passed away, Dag Østerberg. I remember reading a text where we argued that the contribution of sociology to society is not just findings, empirical findings, what is happening out there. Another and equally important contribution is actually language, concepts. Just to take an example, it's one of my favorite examples actually. I guess that not many of you would know that the word network was first used in a sociological sense by a guy called J.A. Barnes in an article about a small fishing community in Norway, on Norway's west coast. It was published in 1954 in an article in Human Relations, Class and Committee in a Norwegian island, Paris. Who would think that a small case study from a distant community in Norway would actually contribute to world language? And now this word is now all over the place, right? Interesting, and there is many examples that we can use, and I would argue, of course, adaptation is another one. Concepts help us to reflect on our predicaments. We need language in order to think. We are dependent of having names for things to manage them. Sociological language is no different from other languages in this respect. But concepts are also lenses. They enable us to see something as something, which is all good if it hadn't been for the fact that concepts also make us blind, because they come with shades. What we do not have name for, we tend to ignore. I do not know any better way of illustrating this point by quoting my favorite novelist from my now distant youth, Hermann Hesse. Just read. It's from his book Steppenwolf, okay? Published in 1927. Just imagine a garden with hundreds of different trees, thousands of different flowers, hundreds of different fruits and herbs. Now, if the only botanical distinction the gardener knows is that between edible things and weeds, he will not know what to do with 9/10 of his garden. He will uproot the most enchanting flowers, fell the finest trees, or at any rate detest and frown upon them. Well, we may easily conclude that this gardener is in need of a richer language. With his limited vocabulary, he risks doing irrevocable damage to his garden. The point I raise here is analog. Could it be that we run a similar risk when we talk about eradicating poverty and cope with climate change? And that we therefore need to think hard about the language we are using, not just because language provide a lens for how we do or don't see with regard to this particular nexus, but also because it determines how we act in the next instance. The way we now talk about climate change in adaptive terms is strongly influenced by what you would know as resilience theory. Resilience theory was evident in the fourth IPCC report that came out in 2007 from the second working group. The resilience terminology also flourishes in a recent FAO report on climate change and fisheries, in a chapter that I co-authored, for instance. I will put this away. My wife will criticize me. Okay, the adaptation concept is now all over the place, and not just in the climate change vocabulary. It can be seen in terms like adaptive systems, adaptive networks, adaptive capacity, adaptive learning, adaptive governance, adaptive management, adaptive co-management, adaptive cycle, adaptive leadership, and I'm still counting. Adaptive may soon become an adjective that is as much in use as sustainable. Like Österberg points out, resilience theory, where this term arrives from, is a good example of how concepts seep through from the academic analytical side to the political, engaged, and operational side. Here I'm quoting this guy, Christian Lund. Dane, I assume. Certainly not Norwegian. If we had talked about climate change from another perspective than resilience theory, like political economy or political ecology, I'm not sure that we would have talked about adaptation at all. Instead, we would have talked about power, including the power of language, and we would certainly have been talking about social justice. Lund here believes that it would be a mistake to think that analytical perspective and conceptual hair-splitting is just of academic interest, with relevance for or impact, with no relevance for or impact on the rest of society, including the poverty, climate change nexus in the context of small-scale fisheries. To recognize what we are observing and to talk about it in a meaningful way, we need hair-splitting. We need fine-tuned concepts that capture the essence of the problem. But we should not, and here I repeat myself, be interested in more than the descriptive attributes of our concepts. We should also ask, like Austin does, whether the language of climate change and poverty eradication does what we need it to do, for instance, in small-scale fisheries. There is, among social scientists, also here in Sweden, I've noticed some ambivalence with regard to resilience theory and the idea of social change as an adaptive evolutionary process. Not that there have never been social scientists who have thought about, social theorists who have thought about change in evolutionary terms. For instance, Herbert Spencer, who famously coined the notion of the survival of the fittest, inspired by Darwin. Karl Marx was also inspired by Darwin. However, social science has since then moved away from this idea. And it is nicely summarized in this book. A French sociologist I often return to. people do more than just adapt to the environment. Individually and collectively, they are actively and interactively engaged in changing the environment. In the context of climate change, obviously for the worse. Change can, of course, be different things, as we easily see if we check for synonyms. Some of these synonyms are at different analytical levels. Some are partly overlapping, while some represent qualitatively different forms of change. Change may occur gradually, or it may happen in a more abrupt fashion. Change can be marginal, or it can be comprehensive. It can be willed, foreseen, or unexpected. It may move us in a direction where we do not want to go, but it can also bring positive surprises. It is hard to predict what climate change will do to our society, as we cannot know for sure how our political system will respond to it in the future. But there are obviously limits to how long we can just adapt. As I illustrate in this figure, one may think of change concepts forming a gradient, with adaptation on one extreme and revolution on the other, with evolution and transformation in the middle. As we move along this axis from left to right, quantitative change leads to qualitative shift, involving systemic change, which is where transformation occurs. Consolidation is change put to rest and equilibrium restored, whereas transformation disturbs the current order in lasting ways. Then, whatever equilibrium is achieved is different from the previous one and may well contain the harbinger of change at a later stage. Thus, the kind of social change that we may observe or anticipate, for example, as a result on poverty and climate change, may be all these things. That is an empirical question. In climate change discourse, however, also in the context of these small-scale fisheries guidelines, we tend to operate on the left-hand side of this diagram. We even tend to move from right to left when we really need to move in the opposite direction. The climate change language is about adaptation, not so much about transformation, and hardly ever about revolution. An exception is this person here, Naomi Klein, who argues that the problem with climate change is capitalism. and therefore cannot be the solution to climate change. Following her advice would involve more than the marginal change of adaptation. She says, now is a time, and I quote her, now is a time to leap because small steps won't cut it. Adaptation is a concept that invites baby steps, whereas system change involves giant strides. With climate change, we are looking into the abyss. But poor people in many parts of the world are already there, like in Bangladesh, I just showed. Therefore, the UN SDG 13 and the Paris Accord call for more than incremental change. And the recent IPCC report that was released just a little bit more than a week ago, this is underscored even more. Still, it is the concept of adaptation that dominates also in the most recent report. In the report to policymakers, adaptive, which is not that long, adaptation appears 52 times. And here is an example. Adaptation options specific to national context is carefully selected together with enabling conditions which will have benefits for sustainable development and poverty reduction with global warming. So there is a strong emphasis on this nexus between poverty and climate change. One may wonder why we refrain from using concepts that are more fitting to the challenge. When the urgency and magnitude of the climate change problem suggests otherwise. Why adaptation when what is needed is more fundamental change? Or are we changing the meaning of the word so that adaptation is now supposed to include system change? The reason may well be, and I think there is some truth to that we choose softer language rather than straight talk because we do not want to startle policymakers for whom adaptation invokes fewer connotations than, let's say, revolution does. We should, of course, not use words that lead to fatalism. Instead of scaring people, we need to show them opportunities, what can actually be done. This is also the reason why the small-scale fisheries guidelines are voluntary. The language is soft, but it still contains I would argue, a very progressive agenda. However, and this is important, soft language is not the same as neutral language. The adaptation concept obviously has less teeth than the word revolution has, but it is no less political. This is a book I would recommend, The Climate Leviathan, A Political Theory of Our Planetary Future by Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright. they argue what I just said. The transformation we need is essentially political. This truth is hidden by the language of transformation. Okay? Climate change and poverty eradication is language independent, as the philosopher John Searle, who was a student of Austin, would put it. Climate change is happening regardless of how we talk about it, right? However, how we define it and what we decide to do about poverty, the poverty-climate change nexus, are not. The policies of change, including the implementation of the SSF guidelines, are indeed language dependent. Talking about climate change in adaptive terms is an illustration of this fact. Our chapter in this FAO report that I just showed on climate change in fisheries begins with another quote from Desmond Tutu. Actually, not this one, but the next one I'm going to show you. So this is sort of pinpoint some of the. This one. No community with a sense of justice, compassion, or respect for basic human rights should accept the current pattern of adaptation. Leaving the world's poor to sink or swim with their own meager resources in the face of the threat posed by climate change is morally wrong. So there is morality, which is part of that. The morality is part of this. I find that interesting. I will talk a little bit about the moral aspects of this whole discourse in the following. Interestingly, this is also how Garrett Hardin talked about the tragedy of the commons. You may have read this article. It's one of the most cited articles there is. It came out in 1969 in Science. And his paper is also invoked in the climate change discourse, since the atmosphere can be seen as a common resource and global warming as a result of the freedom of individuals to pollute. However, Hardin's most memorable and cited quote, where he actually phrased this, so the essence of how this tragedy evolves. His most cited quote is not this one. For some peculiar reasons, it seems to be forgotten. But if you read his article, this is how he opened it, and this is how he ends it. An implicit and almost universal assumption in the discussion of discussions published in professional and semi-popular scientific journals is that the problem under discussion has a technical solution. A technical solution may be defined as one that requires a change only in the techniques of the natural science, demanding little or nothing in the way we change, a way of change in human values and ideas on morality. Okay? the poverty climate change nexus does not have a technical or scientific solution. Hardin doesn't talk about climate change, but he talks about poverty. These two people do, however, and they are basically saying the same thing. The political problems we face cannot be fixed by simply delivering sciences to the masses. If good climate data and models were all that were needed to address climate change, we would have seen a political response in the 1980s. Okay? Therefore, the political decisions we need to make on issues such as climate change and the poverty eradication requires a different process than that of science. And it would therefore also require a different language, a language within which morality occurs. Also, before we can assess the problem, define it, and subsequently govern by it, we need to agree on how to talk about it. For that we use for itself. We do. And when we do that, we do not speak from an ethical and moral vacuum. Hence, the definition of the problem is the problem. As Rittel and Weber noted in another much cited paper, which also talk about poverty, by the way. The term that the term they introduced for such problem is wicked. Climate change has been defined by some as not only a wicked problem, but a super wicked problem. And the reason why problems like poverty and climate change are wicked is that they are often part of bigger problems, like those of capitalism, as Naomi Klein suggests. Climate change as a wicked problem is not a problem solved once and for all. And people may advance above the poverty line, but they may easily fall back under it. Wicked problems, therefore, do not go away. Like, in fact, also Hardin argued, Rittel and Weber assume that the problem-solving process is different from a scientific one. And this is what they suggest in their article that came out in 1972, I believe. No, 3. This is what they say about process. Approaches should be based on a model of planning as an argumentative process, in the course of which an image of the problem and the solution emerges gradually among participants as a product of incessant judgment subjected to critical argument. One cannot imagine such a process without language and the importance of language, of course.
There are those who argue that democracy is what makes climate change policies ineffective, and that we therefore need a more authoritarian rule. The quote, and we might easily end up there, which is what Mann and Wainwright are arguing. The quote by Rittel and Weber suggests otherwise. The small-scale fisheries guidelines see a role for the state, but they do not advocate less democracy and human rights. On the contrary, the guidelines emphasize the importance of empowering the pool in the governance process, and they make no exception for climate change. Here is another philosopher that you may recognize, Bertrand Russell, who also had something to say about change, but he made a distinction between change and progress. Change is scientific. Progress is ethical. Change is indubitable, whereas progress is a matter of controversy. Change, in other words, is something we can study, describe, measure, and predict with a varying degree of certainty. Should we not be convinced about what we learn, the remedy would be closer scrutiny, more research, higher quality data, and better models. Progress, on the other hand, belongs to a different discursive realm. All progress is change, but not all change is progress. Okay? Progress is normative. It refers to our social values and aspirations. Whereas empirical statements about change may be right or wrong, progress may be good or bad. Factual change is true for all. What constitutes progress, on the other hand, is a matter of judgment, as Bertrand Russell has said. In small-scale fisheries, for instance, whether the observed change is positive or negative would be in the eye of the beholder. A notable thing about the small-scale fisheries guidelines is that they were developed through a participatory process, much like the one Rittel and Weber recommend, involving literally thousands of stakeholders around the world. In the final stage, there was a so-called technical consultation in FAO lingo, and I was part of that. But rather than being technical, the deliberations among all these delegates were about values and norms and governance principles involving not just state delegates, but also civil society representatives and a few academics like myself. When FAO finally endorsed these guidelines, they did it on the basis of a reached consensus on what constitutes progress in this sector. This, I argue, is precisely what makes these small-scale fisheries guidelines powerful, regardless of the fact
that they are voluntary. As any other law or declaration, the SSF guidelines are what Austin would call a performative utterance, a collective speech act, if you want. The SSF guidelines mention change 25 times and adaptation 12. But transformation and revolution are not mentioned at all. Still, if implemented, the SSF guidelines will, in many instances, bring systemic change to small-scale fisheries that would make them better equipped to cope with climate change. As I've argued, addressing poverty is a way of also enhancing coping capacity. The nexus between poverty eradication and climate change action goes both ways. Let me conclude. In governance, we rely on the conceptual framework we have until we replace it with a new one. We cannot avoid it. In this sense, we always walk the talk. We do what we say. And it has nothing to do with organizational hypocracy or not. We may not always be aware of the limiting effects of the language it contains, including scientific language. Scientific disciplines are institutions that not only come with a topic, but also certain assumptions about how the world works. These assumptions and the theories they lead to and conceptualized by, we tend to take for granted because we are disciplined to do that. The discipline of disciplines eventually also tend to discipline our daily language and our political discourse. With resilience theory, we may see a new discipline in the making. In many instances, the problem under scrutiny is wicked, in the sense that it cannot easily be framed by one discipline. It needs both transdisciplinary work and ethical reflection. The poverty climate change nexus is such a problem. It is super wicked. And here I must show you the new book that is coming out next week, where we try to walk the talk. For transdisciplinary work, we need to begin with examining our concepts, what they do and do not. Our concepts or language was not, sorry to say, handed down from the Tower of Babel,
but are social constructs and social contracts or agreements about what to call things that must be put to continuous test in a world that is ever changing. The poverty and climate change nexus involves a similar challenge because it is a dynamic process, involves a dynamic process. We are less stuck in our particular conceptual disciplinary framework than we think we are. I would argue that the implementation of the SSF guidelines on the issue of the poverty climate change issue depends on our ability to think twice about our language, our conceptual framework, and to critically reflect on its performativity. This is not only because what concepts allow us to see. Equally important is what concepts tell us to do. Then it is important that we do not only think about what we say, but also about how we say. Thank you very much.